You are listening to Russell Brand on Under the Skin. With me today is my guest, Mr. Vice President Al Gore. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for having me, Russell.
It must be I watched your film and I loved your film. Whenever you come into a room, everyone stands up. Is that standard? Even like you get standing ovations before a joke's been delivered.
Well, sometimes.
But it seems to be the case in the film. Now, I just to establish it so that you don't feel obligated and tense about the promotional aspect of what this interview must contain. I think it is important for people to see this film, An Inconvenient Sequel, Speaking Truth to Power, because for me, it rendered the issues of our global ecology in a way that was easy to understand, made it clear that there is an imperative that we act now, but also there is great cause to optimism, that there are shifts both from right-wing thinking people, like your man at the end there, that sort of a lovely mayor who shifted in Georgetown, which is, I think, sort of like the bullseye of what you would call conventional republicanism, and also that politics can be functional and effective. That's what I got from your activity at the Paris Climate Conference, where you were able to put together that deal with a solar energy company in India who may have reneged on the Paris Climate Agreement. Little did we know then it would be the United States that would renege on that deal anyway. So, I think it's an important film for people to see. One of the things that struck me, Mr. Vice President, was the way that you appear to be guided to some degree by your spirituality, by your faith. Much of it was words like mission, that you see as a personal mission, and also that some of the language is somewhat biblical, unavoidably, because of the scale of the ecological disaster we are facing. How does your spiritual perspective inform your mission to affect global ecology and our attitude towards it?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for doing this interview and for putting so much thought into it, Russell. I don't wear my spirituality or religion on my sleeve, but it is a core part of who I am. And this is an issue of biblical scale, in the sense that the future of humanity could be at risk were we not to grab hold of this crisis and solve it. The good news is that we are beginning to do just that, but there is so much at stake. It's really essential to put it in the context of will we have a future or not? Again, I'm convinced we will, but this is not the normal issue. We're now 7.5 billion people. Our technologies are incredibly powerful, and we have to wrestle with our vulnerability to short-term thinking and greed and behaviors that don't really move us forward into the future.
Which are indeed spiritual issues. Greed is a spiritual issue. One of the things I was struck with time and time again, because greed is to prioritise personal need over social need or fraternity, the brotherhood of man, the collective, it is a spiritual issue, because individualism. I was clocking Betsy's face in the background. I'm always scanning rooms. It's the way I live. So, Mr. Vice President, I like saying Mr. Vice President, by the way. It's an enjoyable thing for a person to say.
Really?
Often I have professors and doctors in here, and I'm such a little social climbing lick spittle. If I get to use a term like that, it fuels my own sense of grandiosity. Now, if we live in a world where a conceptual and a fictitious idea, such as economy, is prioritised over an actual, factual and material idea, such as ecology, what hope do we have? How can we change people's conception of ecology when we have a generation of people that have been schooled in consumerist, capitalist thinking? How are we going to unpick that in a generation? Do you think that economic arguments such as solar panels are cheaper will be a sufficient tool to unpick generations of indoctrination, people that have been taught to think like capitalists?
Well, I think that the rapidly declining cost of both solar and wind, and now electric cars, and now batteries, and sustainable agriculture, forestry, fisheries. These new techniques will help us. But I think you're right that the emphasis on mass consumption as a pathway to happiness is definitely a part of the issue. You and I probably disagree on the role of capitalism per se, and I don't want to get sidetracked too much into that, but I want to...
Do you think it is a sidetrack? Because how is it that people can ever think of the world as their home in the way that you evidently do, with your affectionate and rather beautiful attachment to that image of the Earth, that first photograph, when people clearly see the Earth as a resource, culturally, economically, and I think on a deep philosophical level, if people see the outside world as something that can be consumed, relationships that are consumed, commodities that are consumed, ideas, media that are consumed, without a fundamental and significant shift, how can you hope to achieve such an ambitious a goal, thanks mate, as saving the world?
Yeah, well, I do totally agree with you that we need a shift in consciousness, and we need a keen awareness of what we're doing to the earth. But I do want to tell you about my views where capitalism is concerned. I believe that the alternatives to capitalism in some form were explored in the 20th century, both on the left and the right, and they were found to have some serious problems and excesses. But capitalism in its current form, I think, is in need of serious reform. We need to start putting a price on the so-called externalities like pollution. Also, the positive externalities. We count investments in education and mental health care and treatment for addictions and community services as an expense, and then we ignore the benefits of those expenditures. So that's a distortion that needs to be remedied. We don't account for the depletion of natural resources, and we should. We ignore the growing inequality in incomes, which is threatening the future of democracy if we don't address it.
Yes, because built into the economic model under which we labour, there is no potentiality for the inclusion of that criteria.
That's right.
Now, the failings of the ideologies of the last century and all their extremism and the war and the havoc that they wreaked, for me, does not put a full stop on the potential for new systems and evolving systems emerging. National Socialism, terrible idea. Communism as practice, particularly Soviet communism, which really repeated the model of the Tsarism that preceded it, rather than being a legitimate, Soviet experience where power was paralleled and equalised. Clearly a huge failure. But that doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be huge shifts. I'm thinking of, I've read this quote, and I wonder what you think about it. It's by this man called Satish Kaur. When he spoke to Bertrand Russell, who obviously in the late 60s was a prominent campaigner for nuclear disarmament, he said, what's the point in getting rid of these nuclear missiles if we don't change the consciousness that invented them? Because people will continue to manifest these kind of tools and these kind of weapons. Something about that stays with me, that what you seem to have experienced personally is a transformation in the way that you see the world. Now, how much impact can be had politicking at the Paris climate to get India to accept solar power only for the US to renege on it because of individualism, consumerism, materialism, a platform that's been laid for 50 years for Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't appear in a vacuum, although there seems to be one inside of him. So I think that I think we have to be, to achieve the kind of thing that you want to achieve, I think that there needs to be a transformation on an individual level that is quite profound.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that there are fundamental truths about human nature that are going to cause both problems and opportunities, whatever political or economic system we find ourselves living in. I have always had immense respect for for the founders of the United States of America, because they were humanists who separated religion from politics and actually took into account some of these truths about human nature. And a British citizen, Lord Acton, said famously, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And putting boundaries around the accumulation of too much power by a single individual or a small group of individuals, either in the political system or the economic system, is a recipe for danger. And one of the reasons we have this climate crisis is that the large carbon polluters have accumulated too much power to influence our politics, and they've distorted the conversation about climate by using their money to put out climate denial and create false doubts in exactly the same way that the tobacco companies did years ago. They hired actors and dressed them up as doctors and put them in front of cameras to falsely reassure people that what the doctors had found out about smoking cigarettes and lung cancer was not true. And now the carbon polluters are doing exactly the same thing about the climate crisis.
Except with a half a century of entrenchant funding for academic studies. So now they don't require actors because the whole thing is theatre. The whole thing is a play. Now, when you talk about the potency of utility monopolies, Mr. Vice President Al Gore, who's a long name to say continually.
You can just use Al if you want.
Just say Al. Call
just
me Al.
Al.
It's actually happened. I knew this would happen at some point.
Or your adequacy, if you want to be proper.
Your adequacy. That's a formal... okay, instead of your excellency. That's so sweet.
Al is fine.
All right, because I thought for a minute you were laughing at the rigmaroles of English culture, Your Highness. I mean, we love a title over here, by God. So, yeah, it's for a person that's been Vice President of the United States in a period in which many of the economic decisions that have led to the kind of entrenchment utility monopolies that we are under which America now suffers, perhaps that's a fair word. You were there, and so I've heard it said before that a lot of people said, "Oh, I left Parliament or I left Congress so I could focus on politics," because Yanis Varoufakis came in here once and he said politicians only have power within the limitations of their role. Did you find that when you were Vice President of the United States, that your power was quite limited, that your ability to be effective, particularly with the issues that you're passionate about like ecology, were limited because ultimately state power is nullified by superseding economic powers and financial interests?
Well, I think the skillful exercise of political power, which includes the mobilizing of public opinion, can bring about more potential for change than perhaps in any other position. But one of the limitations of working in the White House is that you cannot focus only on one issue. You have the responsibility to focus on many. And one of the luxuries that I have now is the freedom to focus almost exclusively on the climate crisis and those elements of the crisis that are connected to the way our news media operates, the way our economic system operates. But I see it almost exclusively now through the lens of the climate crisis. And I think we have to make it the top priority.
I agree with you, but is that sort of a moot point unless there is sort of powerful legislation on an international level that either prevents or prohibits profiteering by these monopoly utilities that you speak? Wouldn't it affect the core crises of our planet? So, well, the way that oil is refined, the amount of profit these companies, like you said, they're more heavily, like traditional energy resources are more heavily subsidized than modern renewable energy
40
resources.
40 times as much.
So wouldn't you make that illegal overnight? Just say, stop subsidizing it, make global change. Doesn't it require a kind of radicalism? Because when I see these apocalyptic, revelatory images, fires, storms, Filipino death, then I think, well, it's not too much to ask to simply say, right, from forget 2040 or 2050 or some other far-flung title of a Kubrickian movie. Tomorrow, no more profiting. Like this. Now that's not possible, is it? Because the political and economic model, which is in a way fictitious, is conjured by the consciousness of man, will not permit it. You can't make those kind of changes. You can't say, well, there's no more GM anymore. There's no Exxon. Exxon's closed. State reclaims it.
There was a famous economist who once said, things take longer to happen than you think they will, and then they happen much faster than you thought they could. And changes in consciousness sometimes take time, but they can occur. And this climate movement is very much in the tradition of previous movements that changed consciousness, the abolition of slavery, the granting of the right to vote to women, the civil rights movement in my country, anti-apartheid, most recently the gay rights movement.
Yes.
If someone had told me even 5 years ago that gay marriage would be legal in all 50 U.S. states and would be accepted, honored, and celebrated by 2/3 of the American people, I would have said, I sure hope so, so, but I think you're being completely unrealistic. But the climate movement, like all these previous movements, eventually gets to the point where the straw men are discarded and you see the central question, which is a choice between what is moral and right and what is immoral and wrong. And that's where we are right at that tipping point in the climate movement now.
I hear you, Al, but a prominent civil rights campaigner once said to me, power will always yield on civil rights issues eventually, because ultimately it doesn't affect their resources. But when you go for money, that's when you will face resistance. Now, and to be pernickety, whilst there have been huge successes in civil rights in the last half century, one don't have to spend too long on Google to see that African American, right? So and now we're talking about something where there is a huge ticking clock. So I suppose it's not like I want to encourage hysteria, but I sort of sense that radicalism is required. And you, in your new transcendent role, your role as a kind of global mensch, a bodhisattva of the climate movement, are sort of uniquely positioned to spell out just how, like, parts of the film I watch and I think, my God, this is a serious crisis, and you're educating people all over the world. You're doing a tremendous job. Who am I, a mere celebrity, to even question you on this subject? But my point is there's a type of, it seems to me, my intuition is that there is such an entrenchant corruption within politics, that the financial industry has these things sewn up so deeply, that ordinary people find it so hard to have purchase, that in each of the issues that you have said, whether it's women's rights, African American rights, civil rights, apartheid, blood is spilled, great men are imprisoned, women die in chains before anything changes. Do we have this time with this apocalyptic issue? Do we not have to evoke the deities and the demons? Do we not have to speak to people on the level of their deepest, truest self about what kind of world they want to live in, what they're prepared to sacrifice, who they're prepared to confront, and when?
No, I don't disagree with that at all. I think it is time for people to take action, absolutely, and to. I'm very proud. My daughter was arrested in a protest against the new natural gas pipeline network in the U.S. And so, times have changed when a parent says, "Oh, I'm so proud my daughter was arrested," but I am.
And what does that say about authority when a parent is now proud that authority is challenged? It says that authority is de facto corrupto. No, and Donald Trump really is just a grotesque exaggeration of the preceding decades. No disrespect, because you took part in those administrations, but without Clinton, without Obama, you don't get Trump. We were being coached, we were being lubricated, we were being fluffed and prepared for the Trump thrust. I don't know what to call it. The phallic references seem somehow appropriate with that man. But with school, we taught people to be individualist. We taught people to be materialist and consumerist, and now we're surprised when it's a selfish, racist, sexist president that leads the world?
Well, I would interpret that history differently from the way you do. I think that there are a lot of good people trapped in bad systems, but when you work for positive change, sometimes there is a backlash, and I think that Trump represents a backlash. I think that Brexit represented a backlash. I think that for a lot of complex reasons, globalization, intelligence added to automation, the growth of inequality, there is a lot of unhappiness and unrest about the stagnation of middle-income wages for decades now. And a demagogue can take advantage of that and focus it in an irresponsible way.
But the nexus of each and every one of those issues is an economic system that will not yield power. When we talk about, why do we have this system? It's because the people that are dominant, this system works absolutely fine, thank you. We don't want to change it. We don't care if the planet is destroyed. We don't care if if there's economic inequality across the planet. I would see Brexit and Trump as, forgive my language, as a democratic population saying, fuck you to power. In both cases, you're not looking after us. Why should we care? Why should we care?
Yeah,
We've been taught that Muslims are different. We've been taught that women are inferior. We've been taught all this talk about gay people. People are bored of hearing it because for decade after decade, they've witnessed power not taking care of their interests.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this wave of populist authoritarianism is a response to the unhappiness and anxiety that people have been feeling for quite some time. But how do we bring change in spite of economic interests opposing it? Take one example, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. You talk about an economic set of interests opposing that change. That was massive. Nelson Mandela said, it's always impossible until it's done. And this kind of change comes about sometimes when the potential for change builds up, pushing against a barrier that suddenly gives way, and then you see a tremendous change that people did think was impossible, but eventually came.
Yes.
I think there's a generational aspect of change as well.
Yes.
I think the younger generation now is far more committed to saving the climate than those in my generation. And I think it's because they've seen that every night on the news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. And if the news media doesn't connect the dots, then they connect the dots themselves. And they're understanding that this change is essential. It does require a new way of thinking. I absolutely agree with that. How do we bring that about? Ranting and railing against it has its place. Working within, and I'm not characterizing you that way, Russell.
Good.
I myself have been characterized that way.
I know, those are some of my favorite bits of the film, your ranting and railing bits.
I think that has its place, but patiently working within the system as it exists to try to pull the levers and press the buttons and make the machinery operate in a more constructive way also has its place.
But Al, every one of these examples you give, I can't help but think of an alternative narrative. You know, Nelson Mandela, he went down for 27 years. He was prepared to kill and die for what he believed in. And ultimately, I think if we investigated it, the apartheid ended when the economic interests that benefited from apartheid found a way of manoeuvring so that they could maintain their power without apartheid. And having been to South Africa relatively recently, I didn't fancy being black there much. You know what I mean? I didn't think, this would be a doddle living in that township.
But
white people are still living behind barbed wire. You know, now the way from my limited experience, it seems like what power does is what is the bare minimum we can give these people? What is the bare minimum? So if we aim at bare minimum, that's what they'll give us. So for me, it seems like what we should do is focus on radical annihilation, overhaul and revolution. And that way we might get some kind of parity, some kind of justice. So, do you not think, I understand that real change is happening, you know, that solar power and renewable energies is better. You're right. You're 100% right. So, why not focus on, identify the obstacles, and then make it clear that these are the targets. These companies are the problems.
That's what I try to do.
Attack.
That's exactly what I try to do, is to focus on
Exxon, Koch brothers.
Yes, absolutely.
So why can't we have, Exxon now has to be nationalized. It's already subsidized. We're already paying for it. So now we're going to own it. Why can't you do that?
Part of the movie focuses on the investigation of ExxonMobil that's now underway. I hope they will be held legally accountable for the fact that they have financed climate denial, as the Koch brothers have financed climate denial. They've tried to fool people into thinking the crisis isn't real, and now they're trying to fool people into thinking that the renewable alternatives are not viable and real as well. It's very insidious.
Yes, it is insidious, and the consequence of it is, I suppose, maybe I see the world differently. Since I recently became a father. I have a 9-month-old.
Congratulations.
Thank you, man. It's changed everything. I'm so in love with her. It's incredible.
What's her name?
She's called Mabel. I went for a walk with her this morning in the fields near where we live. I look at the tree. I look at every time. And I think about that our connection to nature is absolute. This is it.
Yeah.
And when you show that image, as you repeatedly do in your film An Inconvenient Sequel, which, it's a good title in a way. It's sort of ironic. I like it. It's cool. But it's got the word inconvenient in it. It's meta. You're double meta. Vice meta. It makes me feel that one has to nurture the inherent connection we have with this planet.
Yes,
we have to personalize it.
Yeah.
All things have become commodified. It's very difficult for people that are struggling to see the significance of broad global issues when globalization, whilst it has brought sort of a commodity revolution, and we've all got wonderful phones, thank you very much, they're delightful. What it's also done is it's turned us into a planet of consumers that see, and this is why at the beginning of this interview I spoke about spirituality, because I think this is where the transformation must take place. The way we regard the exterior world, the way that we regard ourselves and our role on this planet, as you evidently do as a servant. You are obviously living in service now, and the feeling that if I dare be so bold as to speak for most people, I think most people think that politicians are corrupt, people in positions of power are untrustworthy and manipulative liars, and that we should divorce ourselves from power. And I think to have a person in your position who has been behind the curtain, who must know things that if you uttered them out loud, your life would be at risk, to see a person like you embracing an issue in this way is very, very heartening for ordinary people. Thank you. My hope is that we continue to aggressively pursue these issues and identify and target who the problem is. Aggressively.
I agree. This is a time for passion. This is a time for people to mobilize. I couldn't agree more.
I wish we had you for longer, Vice President Al Gore, but I know there are many, many people to speak to, that you've got an important and busy schedule. It's been really, really lovely to have you here. I respect you very much.
Say one thing?
Say what you want, man.
The movie is in 340 theaters this Friday, and tickets are available at all of the places you get them. And then a week from Friday, it opens widely all across England. An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power.
Go and see it. You'll probably get more from it than I watched it. I was really enjoying it. You might feel guilty eating popcorn. Like at certain points, you might think, oh no, what am I doing with my life? But it's an optimistic film. You will learn from it. I endorse this film. I went and saw it. Normally, you know how you have to, sometimes if you interview someone important like you, they force you to watch the film. Normally I go, I ain't going anyway. Someone else watch it and tell me. This one I actually went and saw myself, and I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. And I
like your relationship with your dog. I like your cowboy boots. I like a lot of things about you, Al Gore. Thank you for what you're doing for the world.
Thank you for the interview.